The autumn rain fell against the windows of the Amberley drawing-room in a rhythm that matched the quiet desperation in Charlotte's heart, each droplet a small percussion against glass that had witnessed 28 years of her life within these walls, 28 years that society had measured and found wanting. She sat in the corner nearest the fire, a book of astronomical observations open in her lap, though her eyes had long since ceased to follow the careful notations about Jupiter's moons, for the voices from the adjoining parlor carried through the half-open door with that particular clarity that comes when one is the subject of pitying conversation. 28, her Aunt Marguerite was saying, the words floating through the doorway like unwelcome ghosts, and not a single prospect this season. Vivienne, you must face the truth of it. Charlotte's mother responded in tones both defensive and resigned, a combination Charlotte had heard so often it no longer pierced as sharply as it once had. She is accomplished, well-read, her deportment is beyond reproach. She is peculiar, Aunt Marguerite interrupted, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. She speaks of stars and mathematics when she should discuss watercolors and needlework. She has that unfortunate tendency toward honest discourse when a clever young woman should cultivate mystery, and frankly, Vivienne, at her age, with her habits so firmly established, what gentleman could possibly— The sentence remained unfinished, but its meaning hung in the air as complete as any constellation Charlotte had ever charted. She closed the book with careful precision, her fingers tracing the worn leather binding as if it might offer some comfort against the familiar ache that had settled in her chest like an old companion, unwelcome but known. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the Persian carpet, and Charlotte found herself thinking, not for the first time, that there was a peculiar freedom in hopelessness, a strange liberation in accepting that the future society had prescribed for her marriage. Children, the management of a household under a husband's benevolent authority, would never materialize. She could pursue her studies of the heavens without the interruption of courtship, could order her days according to her own inclinations rather than a spouse's preferences, could exist in the margins of society's expectations, where the rules, mercifully, grew less stringent for those already judged failures. Yet beneath this philosophical acceptance lay something more complicated, a longing she refused to name even in the privacy of her own thoughts, a wondering about what it might be to be truly seen, to be chosen not despite her peculiarities, but because of them, to be loved for the precise qualities that made her unmarriageable in the eyes of the world. The rain intensified, and Charlotte rose from her chair, moving to the window where the grey London afternoon stretched before her like an uncertain promise, the city obscured by sheets of water that blurred the boundaries between earth and sky, solid and ephemeral, hope and resignation. The Duchess of Marlborough's ballroom glittered with 1,000 candles reflected in gilt mirrors, transforming the assembly into a kaleidoscope of silk and jewels, and of carefully orchestrated beauty, designed to facilitate the most important transaction of a young woman's life, and Charlotte stood at its periphery like a scholar observing a phenomenon she could catalogue but never truly join. She had perfected this position over the years, this careful placement, near enough to satisfy propriety's demands, yet far enough to avoid the scrutiny that inevitably led to pitying glances or, worse, the forced cheerfulness of matrons who spoke to her with the particular kindness reserved for the afflicted. The younger women swirled past in their pale muslins, their faces bright with hope and calculation, measuring each gentleman's title against his fortune, his looks against his temperament, playing the intricate game Charlotte had never quite mastered, had perhaps never truly wanted to master, though she could not deny the small ache that bloomed in her chest when she watched a young couple's eyes meet across the dance floor with that spark of genuine interest. Her mother stood across the room, her anxious gaze finding Charlotte every few minutes, each glance a silent plea that Charlotte might somehow, miraculously, transform into the kind of daughter who attracted suitable attention, who knew how to deploy a fan with coy precision, who could discuss nothing of consequence with an appearance of fascinated engagement. Near the refreshment table, Charlotte caught fragments of conversation from a cluster of debutantes, their voices carrying that particular pitch that suggested they wished to be overheard. 8 and 20, can you imagine? One whispered, her tone mixing horror with a certain smugness. My mother says she had her chances when she was younger, but she discouraged every gentleman with her talk of mathematics and celestial bodies. Most inappropriate for a lady of quality. Another laughed, the sound like breaking glass. Perhaps she means to marry a telescope, since she seems to prefer their company to any gentleman's. Charlotte felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame precisely, but from the weary frustration of being perpetually misunderstood, reduced to a cautionary tale for girls barely out of the schoolroom. Her entire existence compressed into a warning about the dangers of female education and intellectual ambition. She moved toward the terrace doors with deliberate casualness, as though she sought air rather than escape, as though the ballroom had grown warm rather than unbearable. The October night received her with cool indifference, the stars overhead obscured by London's eternal haze, and she stood at the stone balustrade wondering, as she had wondered countless times before, whether the loneliness of spinsterhood was truly worse than the loneliness she suspected might exist within an ill-matched marriage, whether freedom from society's expectations might be its own form of contentment, whether she was brave enough to believe her own philosophy or merely skilled at constructing elaborate justifications for her failure to secure what every woman was supposed to want above all else. Charlotte had been on the terrace perhaps 10 minutes when she became aware of a presence in the ballroom doorway, a figure that drew her attention not through movement or sound, but through the peculiar quality of stillness he possessed, a stillness that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the light and noise of the assembly. And when she turned to look, she found herself meeting the gaze of a man she recognized from reputation, though they had never been formally introduced. Sebastian Thornwood, Duke of Ravencrest, recently returned from the Peninsular Wars with a collection of medals and, if the gossips were to be believed, a temperament so severe that even the most ambitious mothers had despaired of softening him toward matrimonial inclinations. He stood with military precision, his dark evening clothes impeccable but somehow austere compared to the peacock display of the other gentlemen, and Charlotte could see, even from this distance, the thin white line of a scar that traced from his temple to his jaw, a mark of violence that society whispered about in tones mixing fascination and unease, as though suffering itself were something indecent to display. His eyes held hers for a moment that stretched longer than propriety should have allowed, and Charlotte felt an unexpected flutter of something she could not quite name, not attraction precisely, for his face was too stern for conventional handsomeness, his bearing too forbidding for the kind of romance young women sighed over, but rather a sense of recognition, as though she were looking at another creature who existed at the margins of society's carefully orchestrated performance, another soul who had learned to stand apart. She turned back toward the garden, assuming the moment had been merely coincidental, that a man of his rank and consequence would have no interest in a spinster astronomer who had long ago exhausted her social value, but she heard footsteps approaching across the terrace stone, measured and deliberate, and then his voice, deeper than she had expected, roughened perhaps by years of shouting orders across battlefields, said, "Lady Charlotte Amberley, I believe, though we have not been properly introduced, an oversight I find myself wishing to remedy." Charlotte turned to find him closer than she had anticipated, near enough that she could see the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, the tension in his jaw that suggested pain carefully controlled, and she managed a curtsy that felt awkward under the intensity of his regard. "Your Grace, I am afraid you have the advantage of me, for while I know your name and reputation, I cannot imagine what has prompted this introduction, as I am quite certainly the least interesting person at this assembly." Something flickered across his face, too quick to interpret, and he said, "I have spent the past hour observing this gathering, Lady Charlotte, and I would argue precisely the opposite, that you are perhaps the only interesting person present, for while everyone else performs their prescribed roles with practiced precision, you alone seem to actually think about what you observe, to see rather than simply look, and I wonder if that is a quality developed through your studies of the heavens, and this ability to perceive what others miss." The words struck her with unexpected force, not because they were flattering precisely, but because they suggested he had been watching her with attention, had noticed something about her that went beyond the superficial judgment society usually rendered, and Charlotte found herself momentarily speechless, unsure whether to feel exposed or validated, whether this was some elaborate prelude to mockery or something she dared not even consider. Before she could formulate a response, the Duchess of Marlborough appeared in the doorway with the unerring instinct of a hostess who senses the possibility of scandal, and the formal introduction was made with all proper ceremony, though Charlotte barely heard the words, too aware of the Duke's continued gaze, too confused by the strange intensity of this encounter that ended as abruptly as it had begun, when he bowed, murmured something about the pleasure of making her acquaintance, and withdrew back into the ballroom, leaving Charlotte on the terrace with her racing heart and the unsettling certainty that something had shifted, though she could not have said what or why, only that the Duke of Ravencrest had looked at her as though she were a puzzle he intended to solve, and she had no idea whether that prospect terrified or thrilled her more. The note arrived 2 days later, delivered by a footman in the Ravencrest livery, and Charlotte happened to be in the entrance hall when Matthews, their elderly butler, accepted it with the kind of grave dignity he reserved for correspondence from persons of the highest consequence, his eyebrows rising almost imperceptibly when he read the sender's name before presenting the missive to Lady Amberley on a silver tray. And Charlotte watched her mother's face transform, through a sequence of expressions that might have been comical, had Charlotte not felt a corresponding tightness in her own chest, confusion, giving way to astonishment, giving way to something that looked dangerously like hope, as her mother read the brief message, requesting permission to call upon the family at their earliest convenience. "Charlotte," her mother breathed, her voice trembling with barely suppressed excitement, "the Duke of Ravencrest wishes to call upon us, upon you specifically. He mentions having made your acquaintance at the Marlborough Ball and desiring to further the connection. Oh, my dear girl, I can scarcely believe it. A duke, and such a duke, with all his consequence and fortune. Why should he single you out unless he means to? But I mustn't presume. Yet surely he would not request a formal call if his intentions were not serious. We must prepare the drawing-room. We must ensure everything is perfect. Perhaps you should wear your blue silk. It brings out your eyes, though of course it hardly matters what you wear when a gentleman is truly interested, but we must make the best impression possible." Charlotte felt as though she were watching the scene from a great distance, her mother's words washing over her in a tide of anxious optimism, while her own mind spun through a dozen possible explanations for the Duke's request, none of them particularly flattering to herself. Perhaps he had been commissioned by some friend to assess whether the rumors of her oddness were accurate. Perhaps he collected curious specimens of humanity, the way some gentlemen collected fossils or pressed flowers. Perhaps this was some elaborate wager or cruel entertainment designed to mock the pretensions of a woman who had dared to pursue interests beyond her prescribed sphere, and Charlotte found herself constructing elaborate defenses against the humiliation she felt certain must be approaching, steeling herself against hope, because hope had always seemed to her the most dangerous of emotions, the one most likely to leave a person shattered when reality inevitably failed to match imagination's promises. Her father emerged from his study with the afternoon paper still in hand, summoned by her mother's barely coherent exclamations, and he listened to the news with the measured consideration he brought to all matters of import, before saying, with characteristic understatement, "Well, Charlotte, it seems you have made an impression on the Duke of Ravencrest, though I confess I am as surprised as your mother. Not because I doubt your worthiness, you understand, but because Ravencrest has shown no interest in matrimonial pursuits since his return from the wars. The betting books at White's had him listed as a confirmed bachelor. Yet here we are, and I suppose we must receive him with all proper courtesy and see what develops from this unexpected turn." The waiting began then, the 3 days until the appointed visit, stretching out with excruciating slowness, while Charlotte's mother fretted over every detail of preparation, and Charlotte herself oscillated between a cautious, almost painful stirring of possibility and a grim certainty that she was setting herself up for disappointment, that whatever the Duke's reasons for this call, they could not be what her mother so desperately hoped, what Charlotte herself hardly dared to imagine, and she spent the intervening time attempting to fortify herself against whatever revelation or humiliation awaited, reminding herself that she had learned to live without expectations, that she had made peace with her solitary existence, that nothing this Duke could say or do would truly wound her if she simply refused to let it matter, though even as she constructed these mental fortifications, she found herself standing before her mirror more often than usual, studying her reflection with new uncertainty, wondering what he had seen when he looked at her on that terrace, wondering if she had the courage to face whatever truth this visit would bring. The Duke of Ravencrest arrived precisely at the appointed hour, his punctuality somehow unsurprising given his military background, and Charlotte found herself positioned on the settee in the drawing room, with her mother stationed nearby like a watchful sentinel, her father having elected to remain present for the proprieties, though he had positioned himself by the window with studied nonchalance. And when Matthews announced the Duke, Charlotte felt her heart perform an uncomfortable acceleration that she immediately attempted to suppress, reminding herself that this visit could mean nothing, that she must guard against the dangerous flowering of hope. Yet when Sebastian entered the room, she found herself searching his face for some indication of his purpose, and finding only that same severe composure, that carefully maintained reserve, that revealed nothing of his inner thoughts or motivations. The conversation began with the expected formalities, her mother inquiring after his health and the comfort of his London residence, Sebastian responding with courteous brevity, and Charlotte observed the interaction with a strange sense of detachment, as though she were watching a play in which she had somehow been cast without learning her lines, uncertain when she might be called upon to speak or what she might be expected to say. When her mother finally, with transparent intent, asked Charlotte to pour the tea, she was grateful for the occupation of her hands, the familiar ritual of china and silver that gave her something to focus upon besides the Duke's steady gaze, which she could feel even when she was not looking directly at him, a weight of attention that seemed to demand something she did not know how to give. "Lady Charlotte," Sebastian said, and his voice carried a gentleness that seemed at odds with his austere appearance. "Your mother mentioned in her response to my request that you possess a keen interest in astronomical observation, a pursuit I confess I find far more admirable than the usual accomplishments young ladies are encouraged to cultivate." Charlotte handed him his teacup with hands that trembled only slightly, meeting his eyes for the first time since he had entered the room, and she said, keeping her voice carefully neutral, "I am afraid society does not generally share your assessment, Your Grace, as most consider my interest in the stars to be merely another mark of my peculiarity, another indication that I have failed to develop the proper feminine sensibilities." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes, that made the scar on his face seem less a mark of violence and more a story she suddenly wished to know, and he replied, "Then society reveals its own limitations rather than yours, for surely the contemplation of celestial mechanics requires both intellectual rigor and imaginative capacity, qualities that strike me as far more valuable than the ability to execute a perfect watercolor or play the pianoforte adequately." Charlotte felt her carefully constructed defenses waver at this unexpected validation, and she found herself saying, with more honesty than she had intended, "I have recently been studying the work of Caroline Herschel, attempting to understand her methods of comet detection, though I confess the mathematics sometimes exceed my capabilities." She had expected polite acknowledgement, perhaps a gentle redirection to safer topics, but instead, Sebastian leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening, and he said, "Herschel's work is remarkable, particularly her systematic approach to sky surveys, though I wonder if you have encountered the same frustration I have with her published calculations, which seem to assume a level of prior knowledge that makes them difficult to follow without additional reference materials." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Charlotte had experienced in a social call, a genuine exchange of ideas about parallax measurements and orbital mechanics that left her mother looking bewildered and vaguely alarmed, as though she feared this unseemly display of learning might somehow damage Charlotte's prospects. Yet Sebastian seemed not only comfortable with the discussion but energized by it, his severe features animating in a way that made Charlotte suddenly see the man beneath the facade of ducal reserve, and when he noticed the volume of Lalande's astronomical tables on the side table where Charlotte had left it that morning, he asked if he might examine it, and she watched as he turned the pages with obvious familiarity, commenting on particular passages that had proven useful in his own observations, and Charlotte realized with a start that this was not polite pretense, that the Duke of Ravencrest genuinely shared her passion for the stars, and the recognition sent a flutter of something dangerous through her chest, something that felt terribly like hope, despite all her resolutions against it. The visit lasted precisely the acceptable duration, neither too brief to suggest disinterest, nor so extended as to breach propriety, and when Sebastian took his leave, bowing over Charlotte's hand with formal courtesy, he said, "I have found this conversation most illuminating, Lady Charlotte, and I hope I might have the privilege of continuing our discussion of astronomical matters at some future occasion." And Charlotte could only nod, unable to trust her voice, watching as he departed with that same military precision, leaving her more confused than ever about his intentions, wondering if what had just transpired was merely intellectual companionship between fellow enthusiasts, or something that might possibly, impossibly, be the beginning of something more profound, and finding herself afraid to examine too closely which possibility frightened her more. Weeks passed in a strange suspension between possibility and restraint, the Duke calling twice more at the Amberley residence with scrupulous propriety, their conversations circling around astronomy and literature, while her mother watched with barely concealed anxiety, and Charlotte found herself caught between the dangerous warmth of genuine intellectual companionship and the persistent conviction that she must not allow herself to believe this could lead to anything beyond polite acquaintance. And it was in this state of careful equilibrium that Charlotte found herself one grey November afternoon in Hatchard's, Lending Library on Piccadilly, seeking a particular treatise on lunar observations that had been mentioned in the latest issue of the Philosophical Transactions, navigating between the tall shelves with the familiar comfort of someone who had spent countless hours in this sanctuary, when she turned the corner into the astronomy section and discovered Sebastian standing before the very shelf she had intended to search, his tall frame slightly bent as he examined the spine of a volume with the focused attention she had come to recognize as characteristic of his approach to matters of genuine interest. She froze, uncertain whether to announce her presence or retreat quietly, but he must have sensed her approach because he turned, and she watched that familiar sequence of recognition cross his features, the initial surprise giving way to something that might have been pleasure before his habitual reserve reasserted itself, though not quickly enough to conceal the fact that her appearance had affected him in some way she could not quite interpret. "Lady Charlotte," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed space between the shelves, "I confess I had not expected to encounter anyone of my acquaintance here, much less someone seeking the same obscure corner of natural philosophy that currently occupies my attention." Charlotte felt her careful composure slip slightly at the informality of this unexpected meeting, no mothers or chaperones hovering nearby to dictate the boundaries of acceptable conversation, and she found herself saying with more honesty than she might have managed in a drawing room, "I have always found libraries to be the truest refuge. Your Grace, the only places where one's intellectual pursuits are celebrated, rather than merely tolerated as eccentric peculiarities." Something in his expression shifted, a softening she had glimpsed only once before during their discussion of Herschel's work, and he replied, "Then we share yet another uncommon preference, for I too have found more genuine companionship among these shelves than in most ballrooms or dinner parties, though I suspect society would consider us both rather odd for holding such an opinion." They spoke then of the lunar treatise she had been seeking, which he had already examined and found disappointingly superficial in its treatment of libration effects, and the conversation evolved naturally into a discussion of observational techniques and the challenges of maintaining consistent records across varying atmospheric conditions, and Charlotte realized with a start that they had been talking for nearly a quarter hour, entirely alone, save for the distant presence of the shop clerk, and that Sebastian had shed some measure of his careful formality, his responses growing more animated as they debated the merits of various astronomical instruments, and when he smiled, truly smiled at something she said about the absurdity of attempting observations during London's perpetually cloudy winters, the transformation of his scarred features was so complete, so genuine, that Charlotte felt something crack in the careful defenses she had constructed around her heart, felt hope slip through like light through a suddenly opened door, and she knew in that moment that she was in terrible danger of allowing herself to believe that this severe, brilliant, impossibly complicated man might actually see her as something more than merely an interesting conversational partner, might possibly, impossibly, be developing feelings that matched the ones she was desperately trying not to acknowledge in herself. The morning after their encounter at the library, Charlotte resumed her customary walk through Hyde Park, with her maid following at a respectful distance, the December air crisp enough to sting her cheeks as she followed the familiar paths beneath trees that had long since shed their leaves, and she was contemplating the conversation about lunar libration when she rounded the bend near the Serpentine and discovered Sebastian standing beside the water, his tall figure unmistakable even at a distance, and when he turned at the sound of her approach, she saw no surprise in his expression, only a quiet certainty that suggested this meeting was not accidental, but intentional, and her heart performed that now familiar acceleration, even as her mind cautioned against reading too much into his presence. He greeted her with formal courtesy, inquiring after her health, and requesting permission to walk with her if she found such company acceptable, and Charlotte found herself agreeing despite the voice in her head, warning that this development carried dangers she was not prepared to face, and they began walking the circuit of the park with her maid trailing behind, close enough to satisfy propriety but distant enough that their conversation remained private. And Sebastian asked about her progress with the lunar treatise, and she found herself describing not just her astronomical observations, but the frustrations of attempting serious study while managing the expectations of a household that viewed her interests as eccentricities to be indulged rather than pursuits of genuine value. He listened with that intense focus she had come to recognize, asking questions that revealed both his own knowledge and his genuine interest in her thoughts, and when she mentioned her dream of one day having a proper observatory, rather than making do with observations from her bedroom window, he did not laugh or dismiss the ambition as fanciful, but instead discussed the practicalities of telescope placement and the challenges of maintaining instruments in England's damp climate, and Charlotte felt something in her chest loosen, some long-held tension releasing at this simple act of being taken seriously by someone whose opinion she had come to value more than she cared to admit. The following morning, he appeared again at precisely the same location, and when Charlotte expressed surprise at the coincidence, he said with that slight softening of his severe features that she had learned to interpret as amusement, "I confess I have taken the liberty of adjusting my own morning routine to align with yours, Lady Charlotte, as I have found our conversations to be the most worthwhile use of these early hours." And Charlotte did not know whether to be alarmed or touched by this admission of deliberate pursuit, and she found herself looking forward to these encounters with an anticipation that frightened her, even as it brought color to days that had long seemed gray and predetermined. As the weeks passed and winter deepened, their walks became a regular occurrence, and Charlotte noticed her mother's barely suppressed excitement, her father's thoughtful observation, her younger sister's whispered speculation about whether the Duke's intentions might be serious, and Charlotte herself remained caught between hope and self-protection, telling herself that Sebastian valued her mind and her conversation, but that this was insufficient foundation for the kind of permanent attachment her family was beginning to imagine, yet finding it increasingly difficult to maintain this rational distance when he spoke to her with such evident respect, when he remembered details of conversations from weeks prior, when he occasionally revealed small glimpses of himself, brief mentions of his years in the peninsula, his struggle to readjust to civilian life, his sense of being fundamentally altered by experiences that most of society could not begin to comprehend. And in those moments, Charlotte felt the dangerous pull of recognition and the sense that perhaps they were not so different after all. Two people shaped by their respective battles into forms that did not quite fit the mold society had prepared for them, and she began to wonder, despite all her cautions against such wondering, whether it was possible that Sebastian saw in her not just an intellectual companion but something more, something that might justify the hope she was trying so desperately not to feel. The afternoon rain arrived with a fury unusual for late January, drumming against the windows of the Amberley drawing room with such insistence that conversation became nearly impossible, and Charlotte sat with her embroidery untouched in her lap while her mother had retreated to write correspondence, and Sebastian stood at the window watching the deluge with an expression she could not read, the firelight casting shadows across the scarred side of his face, and the silence between them had stretched beyond comfort into something heavier, more fraught, until he turned from the window and said with unexpected directness, "I find I must speak plainly, Lady Charlotte, for I have spent too many years in circumstances where pretense could prove fatal, and I find myself incapable of maintaining the pleasant fictions that govern most social discourse." And Charlotte set aside her embroidery with hands that trembled slightly, sensing that whatever was about to pass between them would alter the careful equilibrium they had maintained these past months. He spoke then of the war, not with the rehearsed brevity that gentlemen employed when society demanded acknowledgement of their service, but with raw honesty about the mud and blood of the peninsula. The friends lost at Badajoz and Salamanca, the particular horror of surviving when better men had fallen, and Charlotte watched his hands clench and release as he described returning to England to find himself fundamentally changed, unable to take pleasure in the pursuits that occupied his peers, unable to tolerate the triviality of most conversation, haunted by memories that erupted without warning and left him gasping in rooms that suddenly felt too small, too close, and he said, "I tell you this not to inspire pity, which I cannot bear, but because I find myself weary of allowing people to believe my reserve is mere arrogance or coldness, when in truth it is simply that I no longer know how to exist in a world that has not seen what I have seen, that cannot comprehend what it means to carry such weight." Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes, not from pity but from recognition, and she found herself speaking with equal honesty about her own battles, the slower violence of being dismissed and diminished, of watching society decide her worth based solely on her failure to secure a husband by an arbitrary age, out of the particular loneliness of being simultaneously visible and invisible, present in rooms yet fundamentally unseen. And she told him what she had never articulated even to herself, that she had learned to protect herself through resignation, through convincing herself that she did not want what was clearly not meant for her, through building walls of intellectual pride around the vulnerable truth that she longed desperately to be chosen, to be valued, not despite her unconventional mind, but because of it. "I understand," Sebastian said quietly, and the simple statement carried such weight that Charlotte felt something break open in her chest, felt the careful distance she had maintained begin to crumble, and when he crossed the room to sit near her, closer than propriety strictly allowed, she did not draw away but instead met his gaze directly, seeing in his scarred face and haunted eyes a mirror of her own hidden wounds, and he said, "We are both, I think, casualties of different wars, shaped by our respective battles into forms that society finds difficult to categorize or accept," and Charlotte nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat, and they sat in the firelight, while the rain continued its assault on the windows, two damaged souls recognizing in each other not the promise of healing but something perhaps more valuable, the possibility of being truly seen and accepted without pretense or apology. And Charlotte understood in that moment that whatever happened next, this afternoon had irrevocably changed something between them, had created a bond of mutual understanding that transcended the careful boundaries of courtship and touched something far more fundamental and far more dangerous to the careful resignation she had cultivated for so many years. Spring arrived with unexpected gentleness, coaxing the Amberley garden into reluctant bloom, and Mrs. Amberley seized upon the mild weather as justification for a garden party, inviting a carefully selected group of acquaintances to admire the early roses and take refreshment on the terrace, and Charlotte suspected her mother's true motivation lay in providing Sebastian with yet another opportunity to demonstrate his continued interest before the watchful eyes of society, a suspicion confirmed by her mother's particular attention to Charlotte's appearance that morning, insisting she wear the pale green muslin that brought out the color of her eyes, and arranging her hair with more care than usual, and Charlotte submitted to these ministrations with a mixture of resignation and nervous anticipation, for she had sensed a shift in Sebastian's manner during their most recent encounters, a new intensity in his gaze, a particular weight to certain silences that suggested he was building towards something she both longed for and feared with equal measure. The party proceeded according to the predictable rhythms of such gatherings, guests exclaiming over the roses and the unseasonable warmth, her mother moving through the crowd with determined graciousness, while Charlotte remained largely on the periphery, exchanging pleasantries when required, but finding her attention drawn repeatedly to Sebastian, who stood in conversation with her father near the fountain, and she noticed how he periodically glanced in her direction, and when their eyes met across the garden, he gave an almost imperceptible nod before excusing himself from her father and moving purposefully toward her, and Charlotte felt her pulse accelerate as he approached, some instinct telling her that whatever was about to occur would prove significant beyond the ordinary parameters of a spring afternoon. He requested, with exquisite formality that somehow emphasized rather than diminished the weight of the moment, whether she might grant him a few moments of private conversation in the rose garden, away from the general gathering, and Charlotte agreed despite the sudden tightness in her chest. Despite the voice in her head, cataloguing all the ways this might end in humiliation or heartbreak, and they walked together along the gravel path that led to the enclosed garden, where her mother's prize roses bloomed in profusion, the scent almost overwhelming in the warm air, and her maid followed at a distance that satisfied propriety while allowing them the illusion of privacy. And when they reached the bench beneath the arbor, Sebastian did not immediately sit, but instead stood before her with an expression that combined determination and something that looked almost like vulnerability, and Charlotte found she could scarcely breathe as she waited for him to speak. "Lady Charlotte," he began, his voice carrying the same careful control he employed when discussing matters of great import. "I find myself in a position I had not anticipated when I returned to England last autumn, for I had convinced myself that certain experiences had rendered me unsuitable for the ordinary pursuits of civilian life, that the war had damaged me beyond repair for domestic happiness, yet in these months of knowing you, I have come to understand that what I believed was damage was merely the shedding of tolerance for superficiality, for pretense, and for the empty performances that society mistakes for genuine connection." And Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes, even as her mind struggled to accept what his words seemed to imply. And he continued, speaking with increasing fervor about her remarkable mind, her courage in maintaining her authentic self, despite society's dismissive judgment, her refusal to diminish her intellect or her interests to accommodate others' expectations. And he said with devastating directness, "You have shown me that it is possible to exist in this world without compromise, without pretending to be less than what one is. And in your presence, I have found not just intellectual companionship, but something I had ceased to believe possible, a sense of being truly seen and accepted without reservation or judgment." Charlotte tried to speak, to respond to this declaration that was reshaping everything she had believed about her future. But Sebastian raised a hand gently, requesting permission to finish, and he told her that he understood his attentions might be unwelcome, that she might have no desire to exchange her hard-won independence for the constraints of marriage, but that he needed her to know that his regard for her had transcended mere admiration and become something far deeper, something that made the thought of continuing through life without her seem unbearably bleak. And though he stopped short of an explicit proposal, his intention was unmistakable. And Charlotte stood frozen between terror and exhilaration, between the instinct to protect herself through rejection and the dangerous temptation to believe that perhaps, against all probability, she had found someone who valued her not despite her unconventional nature, but because of it. And in that rose-scented garden with spring blooming around them and her careful defenses crumbling, she felt the full weight of hope, terrifying and intoxicating in equal measure, and knew that whatever she said next would determine the entire course of her future. Charlotte's fragile hope lasted precisely 4 days before reality asserted itself in the formidable person of Lady Beatrice Thornwood, the Dowager Duchess of Ravencrest, who arrived at the Amberley residence on a Thursday afternoon with the announced intention of paying her respects, but whose tight-lipped expression and steely gaze suggested purposes far less courteous, and Charlotte's mother received her with anxious deference, while Charlotte herself felt a cold presentiment settle in her stomach as the dowager's eyes swept over her with obvious assessment and found her wanting, and the conversation proceeded with brittle civility until Mrs. Amberley was called away to attend to some household matter, leaving Charlotte alone with Sebastian's aunt, who wasted no time in dispensing with pretense and stated with devastating directness that she had come to discuss the unsuitable attachment her nephew had formed with a woman who was, to speak plainly, far too old to be considered a viable candidate for Duchess. For at 28, Charlotte was well past the age when childbearing could be considered reliable, and the Thornwood line required heirs, multiple heirs if possible, which a woman of Charlotte's advanced years could hardly guarantee. And furthermore, while the dowager acknowledged that Charlotte possessed a certain intelligence, she lacked the accomplishments and social graces that befitted the position of Duchess, having never been trained for such responsibilities, and having spent her years developing her mind rather than the skills necessary for managing a great household and navigating the complexities of high society. Charlotte listened with a composure that required every ounce of discipline she possessed, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling, while the dowager continued her litany of objections, noting that Sebastian had endured enough hardship in the war without shackling himself to a marriage that would subject him to whispers and speculation about why he had chosen so poorly when he might have had his pick of accomplished young women from the finest families. And though the dowager phrased her concerns as solicitude for Sebastian's welfare, Charlotte heard beneath the elegant language the unmistakable message that she was considered unworthy, insufficient, a source of potential embarrassment rather than pride. And when the dowager finally departed with a dismissive nod, Charlotte sat alone in the drawing room, fighting against the tears that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained control, and it was in this state that she found herself an hour later ascending the stairs, when she heard raised voices from her father's study, recognizing Sebastian's controlled baritone and his aunt's sharp tones, and she stopped on the landing, knowing she should not listen, yet unable to prevent herself from hearing the dowager's damning assessment repeated, hearing her own inadequacies enumerated with brutal precision, but then hearing Sebastian's response, his voice cutting through his aunt's objections with uncharacteristic heat as he declared that Charlotte's age was irrelevant, that her mind was worth more than a dozen accomplished young misses who could do nothing but simper and play indifferent pianoforte, that if his aunt believed he had survived the horrors of war only to enter a marriage based on breeding potential and social standing rather than genuine regard, then she understood nothing of what he had learned from watching men die for causes they barely comprehended, and Charlotte pressed her hand against the wall for support as she heard him defend her with a passion that made her chest ache. Yet even as her heart soared at his fierce advocacy, her mind was already working through the implications, understanding with terrible clarity that his association with her would subject him to exactly the kind of scrutiny and criticism that the dowager had articulated, that she would always be seen as the aging spinster who had somehow ensnared a duke, that his choice would be questioned and doubted. And in that moment, standing on the landing with her hand pressed against wallpaper she had known since childhood, Charlotte made a decision that felt simultaneously like self-sacrifice and self-preservation, recognizing that the kindest thing she could do for Sebastian, the truest expression of the regard she had developed for him, would be to release him from an attachment that would diminish rather than enhance his standing. And though the decision felt like tearing something vital from her chest, she knew with absolute certainty that she could not allow him to bind himself to her out of stubborn principle or misplaced honor, when the world would judge him harshly for the choice, and she would spend their life together wondering whether he regretted his defiance of convention, whether he looked at younger women and thought of the heirs she might fail to provide, whether his defense of her masked a growing resentment that would poison whatever affection existed between them. Charlotte sent word the following morning requesting an audience with Sebastian, and when he arrived at the Amberley residence that afternoon, she could see in his expression that he knew something had shifted, that the careful progress they had made toward understanding was about to be disrupted, and she received him in the drawing room with her mother conveniently absent, having been persuaded that Charlotte needed to speak with the Duke privately on a matter of some delicacy, and Sebastian stood before her with that same controlled stillness he had exhibited during their first awkward meeting, as though bracing himself for a blow he had long anticipated, and Charlotte began with words she had rehearsed through a sleepless night, explaining with as much composure as she could summon that she had been giving considerable thought to their association, that while she valued his regard more than she could properly express, she had come to understand that continuing on their present course would be unfair to him, would subject him to precisely the kind of judgment and speculation that a man of his standing should not have to endure, and she watched his expression shift from wariness to comprehension, and then to something that looked remarkably like anger, though he remained silent as she continued, telling him that his aunt had made several valid points about the practical considerations of such a match, about the expectations that came with his position, about the advisability of choosing a wife who could fulfill the duties required of a duchess without the complications her age and unconventional nature would inevitably bring, and she was speaking faster now, desperate to finish before her courage failed, when Sebastian interrupted with a voice like winter frost and asked whether she was quite finished deciding his future for him, whether she had completed her assessment of what he should want and need and desire, and Charlotte faltered, startled by the barely contained fury in his tone, and he stepped closer, his eyes blazing with an intensity she had never witnessed in him before, and demanded to know whether she truly believed him so weak, so lacking in judgment, so susceptible to the opinions of others that he would abandon what he knew to be right and true simply because his aunt disapproved or because society might whisper, and Charlotte tried to explain that she was thinking of his welfare, of his happiness, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture and said that if she wished to refuse him, if she genuinely had no desire for his company or his regard, then she should say so plainly, and he would trouble her no further. But she should not insult them both by pretending that her rejection was somehow for his benefit, by framing her fear as self-sacrifice, and Charlotte felt tears burning in her eyes as she protested that it was not fear but realism, that she was 28 years old with no guarantee she could provide him with heirs, that she had no training in managing a great household, that she would always be the aging spinster who had somehow trapped a duke. And Sebastian moved closer still, so close she could see the scar that ran along his jawline, the one he had earned at Waterloo, and he said with devastating quietness that he had watched men die in muddy fields for abstract concepts of honor and duty, had seen them sacrificed to others' ideas of what was strategically necessary, and he would be damned if he allowed himself or Charlotte to be similarly sacrificed to society's expectations. And he reached for her hand, his touch sending heat through her entire body, and told her that he was not asking for her compliance or her self-abnegation, but for her honesty, for her trust that he was capable of choosing his own path, even if that path led to difficulty. And Charlotte found herself trembling as she looked up at him, seeing in his face an openness she had never witnessed before, a vulnerability that matched her own, and she whispered that she was terrified of being the source of his regret, terrified that in 5 years or 10 he would look at her and wish he had chosen differently. And Sebastian's expression softened as he raised his hand to her face, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped despite her efforts at control. And he said that the only regret he could imagine was the regret of letting fear dictate his choices, of allowing society's judgment to rob him of the one person who had made him feel truly alive since his return from the war. And they stood there suspended in a moment that seemed to exist outside normal time, his hand against her cheek and her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must hear it. And he leaned toward her with unmistakable intent, his eyes asking a question even as his body moved to close the distance between them. And Charlotte felt herself swaying forward in answer, every rational objection dissolving in the face of overwhelming desire, and their lips were a breath apart, when the drawing-room door opened abruptly, and her mother's voice called out an apology for the interruption, having forgotten her embroidery, and the moment shattered like dropped crystal, and Sebastian stepped back with visible effort, while Charlotte pressed her hand to her chest, as though she could physically slow her racing heart, and in the awkward aftermath of nearly consummated desire and her mother's oblivious chatter about the weather, Charlotte understood with absolute clarity that whatever decision she made about their future, it could no longer be based on abstract considerations of propriety or duty, for something fundamental had shifted between them, something that could not be dismissed or denied or sacrificed to fear, no matter how reasonable that fear might be. The silence that followed Sebastian's departure that afternoon was not the comfortable quiet of understanding, but rather the hollow absence of something vital. And though Charlotte told herself she had made the necessary choice, the rational choice, the selfless choice, the weight of that decision settled over her like November fog, thick and inescapable, and when a week passed without word from him, she felt vindication mixed with devastating loss. And when that week became 2 and then 3, and then an entire month, she understood with absolute finality that he had accepted her judgment, had taken her rejection at face value despite his protests, and the relief she had expected to feel at having spared him, future regret never materialized, replaced instead by a grief so profound it shocked her with its intensity, for she had not realized until its absence how much light his presence had brought into her carefully managed existence, how much she had come to anticipate their conversations, the way he looked at her as though truly seeing past the surface dismissals to something worthwhile beneath. And her family's response to the cessation of his visits moved through stages from concern to confusion to resignation, her mother's anxious questions eventually giving way to the same pitying glances Charlotte had endured. Before Sebastian's attention had briefly elevated her status, and autumn arrived with its customary grey skies and early darkness, the season mirroring the melancholy opening of her story as though time itself had circled back to the beginning, erasing the spring and summer of tentative hope as completely as fallen leaves obscured the garden paths. And Charlotte found herself once again in her familiar position by the drawing-room window on rainy afternoons, watching water streak, the glass, and feeling the weight of her 28 years pressing upon her with renewed force. Except now, she carried the additional burden of knowing precisely what she had surrendered, of understanding the difference between never having hoped and having tasted possibility only to watch it dissolve, and she threw herself into her astronomical observations with almost desperate focus, spending long nights at her telescope recording the movements of celestial bodies with meticulous precision, as though the predictable mathematics of planetary orbits could somehow impose order on the chaos of human emotion. And when she encountered acquaintances at social functions, she endured their carefully neutral expressions and studied silences about the Duke with as much dignity as she could summon, understanding that the whispers had undoubtedly intensified, that the gossips were having a fine time speculating about what deficiency in her had finally revealed itself to drive away even the eccentric Duke of Ravencrest, and her mother made one attempt to broach the subject directly, asking gently what had transpired to end such a promising association. But Charlotte could not find words to explain that she had chosen this isolation deliberately, that she had calculated the cost of Sebastian's regard and found herself too expensive a purchase, and so she simply said that they had recognized their incompatibility and mutually agreed to discontinue the acquaintance, which was simultaneously true and the most profound lie she had ever told. And as October gave way to November and the social season began in earnest, Charlotte settled back into her role as permanent wallflower, with a resignation that felt both familiar and utterly foreign, for she had briefly imagined a different future, had allowed herself to envision standing beside Sebastian as his equal, rather than hovering at the margins of society as its peculiar specimen, and the return to her previous existence felt less like homecoming than exile, a punishment she had prescribed for herself in the name of protecting someone who had never asked for her protection. And on particularly difficult nights, she would remember the almost kiss in the drawing room, the heat of his hand against her face, the look in his eyes that had promised understanding and acceptance and something deeper than mere tolerance. And she would wonder whether she had made the right choice or merely the cowardly one, whether her self-sacrifice had been noble or simply another form of the fear that had governed so much of her life. But there was no retrieving the decision now, no way to undo the separation she had initiated, and so she bore the weight of her sacrifice in silence, while autumn deepened into early winter, and the world continued its indifferent rotation without regard for the breaking of one spinster's heart. The invitation arrived on a grey December morning, when Charlotte had largely ceased expecting anything beyond the predictable rhythm of her diminished social obligations, and she stood in the morning room holding the heavy cream paper with its royal seal, reading the formal script that commanded her presence at a reception to be held at St. James's Palace in honor of visiting foreign dignitaries, and her first instinct was to decline, to plead illness or family obligation, or any excuse that might spare her the ordeal of appearing before the assembled nobility as a specimen of failure. For surely everyone who attended would know of the Duke of Ravencrest's brief and inexplicable interest in the aging spinster Charlotte Amberley, would recall how that interest had evaporated as mysteriously as it had begun, and she could already imagine the pitying glances and carefully averted eyes, the whispered conversations that would pause when she approached, and yet even as she considered ways to avoid the summons, she understood that one did not simply refuse a royal invitation without compelling cause, that to do so would bring greater shame upon her family than attending could possibly inflict, and so she showed the invitation to her mother, who responded with a complex mixture of excitement at the honor and anxiety about what it might mean. Whether this was some cruel social test, or perhaps an opportunity for Charlotte to demonstrate that she had survived her brief elevation and subsequent fall with dignity intact, and the weeks that followed were consumed with preparation, with the selection of an appropriate gown that would be neither too modest nor too presumptuous, with her mother's endless instructions about proper behavior in the Queen's presence, with Charlotte's own mounting dread as the date approached, and she found herself lying awake at night contemplating the various ways the evening might unfold, imagining herself standing alone while couples swirled past her in the dance, picturing the moment when some well-meaning acquaintance would ask about the Duke and she would have to smile and say something neutral and deflecting, and as her maid dressed her on the evening of the reception, fastening the pearl buttons of her ice-blue silk gown and arranging her dark hair in an elaborate style that seemed far too youthful for her years, Charlotte looked at her reflection and saw a woman playing at belonging to a world that had made its judgment of her long ago, and the journey to the palace in the family carriage felt like a procession toward execution, her father making awkward attempts at encouragement while her mother fretted about protocol. And when they finally arrived and joined the stream of elegantly dressed nobility ascending the palace steps, Charlotte felt herself withdrawing inward, assembling the armor of detached observation she had perfected over years of social survival, telling herself that this was merely one more ordeal to endure, one more evening of pretending that society's assessment of her worth had no power to wound. And as they passed through the magnificent doors into the glittering entrance hall with its soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers, Charlotte assumed her customary role as witness rather than participant, prepared to observe the evening's pageantry from her familiar position at the margins, never imagining that she was walking not toward another performance of invisible spinsterhood, but toward the transformation of her entire existence. The reception hall at St. James's Palace blazed with candlelight from dozens of crystal chandeliers, their reflected brilliance dancing across gilded walls and polished marble floors, and Charlotte stood near one of the towering columns that lined the perimeter of the vast room, watching the assembled nobility move through the elaborate choreography of court presentation with practiced grace, their jewels catching the light as they bowed and curtsied before the Queen, who sat upon a raised dais at the room's far end, with an expression of benevolent authority, and Charlotte had positioned herself as she always did at such gatherings, close enough to observe propriety, but sufficiently removed to avoid the necessity of forced conversation, her parents having drifted toward acquaintances after ensuring she was adequately situated, and she found herself cataloguing the familiar faces, recognizing the same families who had populated every significant social event of her adult life, the same young women who had married and produced children, while Charlotte remained perpetually unchanged, and the room hummed with conversation and laughter, with the rustle of silk and the murmur of diplomatic exchanges. And Charlotte felt herself becoming almost invisible in the way she had perfected, her stillness rendering her unremarkable amid so much movement and color, and she told herself that she would endure this evening, as she had endured countless others, would smile when necessary, and speak when addressed, and count the hours until she could return to the solitude of her own room, and she was contemplating whether it might be possible to slip away early, without causing offense, when a shift in the crowd's energy made her glance toward the entrance, and her heart, which had been beating with the dull rhythm of resignation, suddenly seemed to stop entirely. For there across the expanse of glittering assembly stood Sebastian Thornwood, Duke of Ravencrest, his tall figure unmistakable even at distance, dressed in formal black that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the severity of his bearing, and he was scanning the room with obvious purpose, his gaze moving across the sea of faces with methodical intensity, and Charlotte pressed herself closer to the column as though she might somehow avoid detection, as though making herself smaller might prevent the inevitable moment when he would see her, and she felt panic rising in her chest, a desperate desire to flee warring with the paralysis that held her frozen in place, for she had spent 2 months constructing a careful equilibrium around his absence, had learned to function despite the constant ache of loss, and seeing him now threatened to shatter the fragile composure she had assembled. And then his eyes found hers across the crowded room, and the world seemed to narrow to just that connection, that recognition that passed between them like an electric current, and she saw something in his expression that she could not name, something that looked almost like determination mixed with vulnerability, and to her absolute shock, he began moving toward her, not quickly but with steady purpose, parting the crowd with his presence, and Charlotte could not move, could not breathe, and could only stand there watching him approach, while her mind raced through impossible explanations for why he would seek her out after months of silence, why he would acknowledge her so publicly when he had accepted her rejection, and she was aware of heads turning to track his progress, of whispers beginning to ripple through the assembly, as people noticed the Duke of Ravencrest crossing the room toward the unremarkable spinster by the column, and still he came, his eyes never leaving hers, and Charlotte felt tears threatening and fought them back, willing herself to maintain dignity, whatever this encounter might bring, bracing herself for words that would either resurrect hope or confirm its final death. Sebastian reached her, and the murmur of conversation around them seemed to fade into something distant and unreal, and Charlotte found herself looking up into his face, with its familiar, severe lines softened by something she had never seen there before, something that looked almost like fear beneath the determination, and he did not speak immediately but stood there as though gathering courage, and she was conscious of the eyes upon them, of her mother's startled face visible in the crowd, of the ripple of curiosity spreading through the assembled nobility like wind across water. And then Sebastian said in a voice that carried clearly despite its controlled intensity, "Lady Charlotte Amberley," and the formality of it made her heart sink, because she thought he meant to acknowledge her politely and move on, to demonstrate that their past association held no awkwardness, but instead he continued, "I have spent 2 months in the greatest misery of my life, which is saying considerable given that I have survived warfare and loss, and I have come here tonight with the Queen's gracious permission to speak words that should have been spoken long ago, words I was too proud and too foolish to say when you attempted to sacrifice your own happiness for my supposed benefit." And Charlotte felt the ground seem to shift beneath her feet, felt her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack, and she wanted to speak, to stop him, and to prevent whatever was about to happen, because the hope rising in her chest was too painful to bear if it proved false. But he was still speaking, his voice growing stronger. "You believed you were doing me a kindness by releasing me from obligation, but you understood nothing if you thought my regard for you was born of duty, or that it could be dismissed by your nobility." And now people were openly staring, conversations dying away entirely as the assembly realized something unprecedented was unfolding, and Charlotte saw from the corner of her eye that even the Queen had turned her attention to them, that the entire glittering court had become audience to this moment, and Sebastian took a step closer, near enough that she could see the emotion blazing in his eyes, and he said with a passion that seemed to strip away every vestige of his usual reserve, "You are the most brilliant woman I have ever encountered, the only person who has ever seen past the scars and the title to the man beneath, who has spoken to me of stars and mathematics and the movements of celestial bodies, as though I were a fellow scholar rather than a duke, who has made me laugh when I thought I had forgotten how, who has shown me that there is more to life than duty and survival." And Charlotte felt tears spilling down her cheeks despite every attempt at dignity, felt her heart breaking and mending simultaneously, and she was dimly aware of gasps rippling through the crowd, of her mother's hand pressed to her mouth, of the unprecedented nature of a duke declaring himself so publicly to a woman society had dismissed as past her bloom, and Sebastian's voice dropped slightly but lost none of its intensity as he said, "I love you, Charlotte Amberley, not despite your 28 years, but because of all that those years have made you, and I have come before the Queen and this assembled court to declare that truth, because you deserve nothing less than absolute certainty of my regard." The silence that followed Sebastian's declaration seemed to stretch across eternity, and Charlotte stood trembling with tears streaming freely down her face, her hands pressed to her chest as though to contain the heart that threatened to burst from the force of its beating, and she watched through blurred vision as Sebastian, this proud duke who had commanded men in battle and carried himself with such rigid control, lowered himself to one knee before her in full view of the Queen and the entire assembled court, and the gesture was so unexpected, so utterly unprecedented in its public vulnerability, that a collective gasp swept through the hall like wind through trees, and Charlotte felt her breath catch as he looked up at her with an expression of such raw emotion that it stripped away every defense she had ever constructed, and he said in a voice that shook despite his obvious effort at steadiness, "I am not worthy of you, Charlotte Amberley, though I will spend my life attempting to become so, for you possess a brilliance of mind and spirit that society in its foolishness has failed to recognize. And I stand before you and before God and our sovereign not as a duke making a gracious offer to a woman of lesser station, but as a man humbled and awed by the extraordinary person you are, asking if you might possibly consent to accept my most ardent devotion." And he reached into his coat and withdrew a ring that caught the candlelight, a band of gold set with a deep blue sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, arranged in a pattern that Charlotte recognized with a start of wonder as the constellation Cassiopeia, and Sebastian said with something almost like pleading in his voice, "Will you marry me, Charlotte? Not because society expects it or duty demands it, but because I love you with every fiber of my being, and cannot imagine facing another day without you beside me." And Charlotte tried to speak, but found her voice had abandoned her entirely, tried to form words through the tears and the overwhelming surge of emotion that threatened to pull her under, and she was aware of the entire court holding its breath, of her mother weeping openly in the crowd, of the Queen leaning forward slightly on her throne with an expression of unmistakable approval, and Charlotte looked down at Sebastian kneeling before her with his heart laid bare, and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of herself, felt years of internalized shame and resignation beginning to crack and fall away, like old paint from a restored masterpiece, and she realized that his love was asking her to see herself as he saw her, to accept that she was not too old or too plain or too scholarly, but rather exactly right, exactly enough, exactly herself. And with trembling hands she reached down to touch his face, her fingers tracing the scar along his jaw that she had come to love because it was part of his story, part of what had made him into the man who could see her truly. And she felt her voice returning, felt strength flowing back into her limbs, and she said with increasing clarity, "Yes, Sebastian Thornwood, I will marry you, not because you are a duke or because society has given its blessing, but because you have shown me what it means to be valued for one's true self, because you have taught me that love is not diminished by age or enhanced by youth, but is rather built on recognition and respect and genuine regard." And as he slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook slightly, and as he rose to his feet and took her hands in his, with a grip that spoke of desperate relief and overwhelming joy, the entire court erupted into applause that echoed off the gilded walls, and Charlotte saw through her tears that the Queen herself was smiling and nodding approval, that this unprecedented public proposal had received the highest possible endorsement. And when Sebastian pulled her close and pressed his forehead to hers, when he whispered words meant only for her ears about love and forever and coming home, Charlotte felt herself transformed not into someone new, but into someone finally, fully herself. The applause that filled the great hall seemed to wash over Charlotte like waves breaking upon a shore, and she stood there with Sebastian's hands clasping hers and felt the reality of what had just transpired, beginning to settle into her consciousness, and she saw that the Queen had risen from her throne and was approaching them with an expression of unmistakable approval, and Charlotte found herself sinking into a curtsy despite the trembling in her limbs, while Sebastian bowed deeply, and Her Majesty said in a voice that carried clearly, "We are most pleased to witness such a declaration of genuine affection, for it does our heart good to see merit and character valued above the shallow considerations that too often govern matrimonial arrangements." And the Queen's endorsement seemed to ripple through the assembled nobility like a stone cast into still water. And Charlotte watched as expressions shifted from shock to approval, as those who had moments before been whispering about the unprecedented nature of the proposal now nodded sagely, as though they had expected nothing less. And her mother appeared at her side with tears streaming down her face, embracing Charlotte with a fervor that spoke of years of worry finally released, and her father stood nearby with an expression of profound relief mixed with something that looked almost like vindication, and even Sebastian's aunt, the formidable Dowager Duchess, who had so vehemently opposed their connection, approached with a stiff dignity and said grudgingly, "It appears I was mistaken about certain matters, and I trust you will both accept my felicitations." And though her tone suggested the words cost her considerable effort, Charlotte recognized the gesture for what it was and responded with gracious acceptance, because she understood that some victories lay not in triumph, but in allowing others to retreat with dignity intact. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and well-wishes, of curious glances and whispered speculation, and Charlotte found herself repeatedly touching the ring on her finger, as though to confirm its reality, tracing the constellation pattern that Sebastian had chosen with such thoughtfulness, and she caught his eye across the crowd multiple times, and saw in his expression a mixture of relief and joy and possessive tenderness that made her heart race. And when they were finally able to steal a moment alone in a quiet corridor away from the celebration, Sebastian pulled her close and said in a voice rough with emotion, "I thought I had lost you forever. Thought my pride and your nobility had destroyed any chance we might have had." And Charlotte reached up to touch his face and replied, "I thought I was saving you from a poor choice, but I understand now that I was denying both of us the right to choose our own happiness." And he kissed her then, with a desperation that spoke of the 2 months they had spent apart. And when they finally separated, he rested his forehead against hers and said, "We begin the wedding preparations tomorrow, for I will not risk losing you again through delay." And Charlotte laughed through her tears and agreed. And in the days that followed, the announcement appeared in every newspaper and became the topic of countless drawing-room conversations. And Charlotte's mother threw herself into planning with an enthusiasm that bordered on frenzy, and Sebastian proved remarkably patient with the endless discussions of flowers and guest lists and appropriate venues, though he insisted firmly that the ceremony take place within 3 months because he said he had already waited long enough for his happiness. And Charlotte found herself swept along in the preparations while simultaneously marveling at how completely her life had transformed, how she had moved from resigned spinsterhood to celebrated bride in the span of a single evening. And yet what moved her most deeply was not the change in society's regard, but rather the quiet moments she shared with Sebastian, the conversations about their future together, the growing intimacy of understanding that developed as they planned not just a wedding, but a life built on mutual respect and genuine affection. The morning of Charlotte's wedding dawned clear and bright, with spring sunlight flooding through the windows of her chamber, where she sat before the mirror and watched her maid arrange her hair with practiced hands, and she felt a curious calm settle over her that was so different from the nervous anticipation she had imagined feeling on such a day. For this was not the frantic hope of a young girl seeking society's approval, but rather the steady certainty of a woman who had chosen and been chosen in return. And when her mother entered the room with tears already gathering in her eyes and said, "You look beautiful, my darling," Charlotte understood that the transformation her mother perceived was not in the elegant gown of ivory silk or the simple wreath of orange blossoms in her hair, but rather in the way Charlotte held herself, in the quiet confidence that radiated from her bearing, in the knowledge that she was walking toward a future built on genuine regard rather than desperate compromise. The ceremony was to take place in Westminster, for Sebastian had insisted that their union deserved such recognition, and as Charlotte's carriage approached the ancient church, she saw that crowds had gathered to witness the wedding of the Duke of Ravencrest to the woman he had so publicly proclaimed his equal, and she felt her pulse quicken not with fear but with a profound awareness of the moment's significance, of how far she had traveled from that autumn afternoon when she had overheard her family's pitying conversation and resigned herself to permanent spinsterhood. And when she stepped from the carriage and took her father's arm, he squeezed her hand and said with gruff emotion, "I am proud of you, Charlotte, proud of the woman you have become, and proud that you waited for a man worthy of your exceptional nature." And his words brought tears to her eyes because she understood that he saw her clearly at last. He saw past society's narrow definitions to recognize her true value. The interior of Westminster was magnificent, with sunlight streaming through stained glass windows and casting patterns of colored light across the assembled guests. And Charlotte walked down the aisle with measured steps and saw Sebastian waiting at the altar with an expression of such profound emotion that it made her breath catch. And she noticed how he stood straighter as she approached, how his eyes never left her face, how his hands trembled slightly when she placed hers in his. And the Archbishop began the ceremony with traditional words about the sacred nature of matrimony. But Charlotte was aware primarily of Sebastian's presence beside her, of the warmth of his hands clasping hers, of the way he looked at her as though she were the only person in the entire cathedral. And when the time came for their vows, Sebastian spoke in a voice that rang clear and strong, promising to honor and cherish her, to value her mind as much as her heart, to build with her a life based on mutual respect and genuine partnership. And Charlotte felt tears streaming down her face as she made her own promises, speaking of love that sees truly, of companionship that honors individual spirit, of a future they would create together, unbounded by society's limited imagination. And when the Archbishop pronounced them married and Sebastian kissed her with tenderness and barely restrained passion, Charlotte understood that this moment represented not an ending to her story of being overlooked and dismissed, but rather the true beginning of a life in which she would finally fully be seen and celebrated for exactly who she was. And as they walked back down the aisle together as husband and wife, as the congregation applauded and church bells rang out across London, Charlotte felt a profound sense of rightness settle into her bones, a certainty that she had not settled or compromised, but had rather waited with patience until love found her in its truest form. 3 years had passed since Charlotte had spoken her vows in Westminster, and the autumn evening found her standing in the observatory that Sebastian had constructed for her on the grounds of the Ravencrest estate, her hands adjusting the brass telescope that pointed toward the darkening sky, while behind her she heard the sound of footsteps approaching and knew without turning that it was her husband, for she had learned to recognize the particular cadence of his walk, the way he moved with quiet purpose through the spaces they now shared, and when he reached her side he placed a gentle hand on the small of her back and said, "The stars are particularly bright tonight," and she smiled and replied, "Venus is visible just there, near the horizon," and he looked through the eyepiece she had positioned and made a sound of appreciation, and Charlotte felt the familiar warmth of contentment settle over her as she stood beside him in the gathering darkness, for this was the life they had built together. These quiet moments of shared discovery, interspersed with the fuller rhythms of running an estate and raising the daughter who even now could be heard laughing somewhere in the gardens below, where her nursemaid supervised her evening play, and Charlotte thought about how society had once proclaimed her hopeless at 28, how they had whispered about her unmarried state with pitying glances and knowing smiles, and yet here she stood at 31, with a husband who valued her mind as much as her heart, with a daughter who would grow up seeing her mother's intellectual pursuits celebrated rather than dismissed, with the publication of her astronomical observations in the Royal Society's journal, bringing her a recognition that would have seemed impossible in those dark days before Sebastian had entered her life. And she noticed how Sebastian had softened over these 3 years, how the severe lines that war had carved into his features had eased into something gentler, how he laughed more readily now and smiled, without the hesitation that had once marked his expressions. And when he pulled her close and said, "Come inside, soon, for the night grows cold, and I would have you warm beside me," she heard in his voice the deep affection that had replaced his initial formal reserve. And she promised to join him shortly after completing her observations, and as he walked back toward the house, she turned once more to her telescope and thought about how love had found her, not when she was young and desperate for society's approval, but rather when she had learned to value herself, when she had developed the strength to recognize genuine regard and the courage to accept it despite her fears. And through the observatory window, she could see the lights of Ravencrest Manor glowing warm against the darkness, could hear the distant sound of her daughter's laughter, mixing with Sebastian's deeper voice as he scooped the child up and carried her inside. And Charlotte understood with profound certainty that patience had brought her not to resignation but to joy. That waiting had allowed her to find not just any marriage, but the right one, built on foundations of mutual respect and authentic connection that would sustain them through all the years to come. Later that same evening, Charlotte stood at the window of their bedchamber, watching the stars emerge one by one against the deepening darkness, while Sebastian sat by the fireplace reading correspondence, and she thought about how this quiet domestic scene would have seemed impossible to her younger self, who had sat in her family's drawing room, listening to pitying conversations about her unmarried state, and she understood now that the timing of love's arrival mattered far more than society had ever acknowledged. For if Sebastian had appeared in her life when she was 18, and desperate for approval, she might have accepted him out of relief rather than genuine recognition, might have shaped herself to fit his expectations rather than standing firm in her own worth. And it was precisely because she had waited, because she had endured the whispers and the pitying glances and the slow erosion of society's hope for her, that she had developed the strength to recognize authentic regard when it finally presented itself, and the courage to accept it despite her fears. And she turned from the window to look at her husband, whose face was illuminated by firelight, and whose expression had softened into the contemplative gentleness that had replaced his earlier severity. And when he felt her gaze and looked up with a questioning smile, she crossed the room and knelt beside his chair, and took his hand in hers, and said nothing because no words were necessary to convey the profound gratitude she felt for the life they had built together. And Sebastian lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her fingers with tender reverence, And Charlotte thought about all the young women who even now sat in drawing rooms across London, believing themselves failures because they had not married by society's arbitrary deadline, and she wished she could tell them that patience was not resignation, that waiting for genuine connection rather than accepting convenient compromise was not weakness, but rather the truest form of courage, and she wished she could show them that worth was not determined by how quickly one secured a marriage proposal, but rather by the depth of character one developed while learning to value oneself independent of society's approval. Dear listener, perhaps you too have felt the weight of time's passage, have heard the whispers that suggest your moment has passed, have struggled against the fear that waiting means losing, and if so, then let Charlotte's story remind you that love which arrives in its proper season brings with it a depth and authenticity that rushed connections can never achieve. For it is only when we have learned to value ourselves that we can recognize those who truly see us, only when we have developed the strength to stand alone that we can choose partnership from a place of wholeness rather than desperate need. And though society may impose arbitrary timelines and pronounce verdicts on those who do not conform to expected patterns, the truth remains that each person's journey unfolds according to its own necessary rhythm, and what appears to be delay may actually be preparation. What seems like failure may actually be the cultivation of wisdom that will allow you to recognize and accept genuine love when it finally appears. And so, if you find yourself waiting while others around you seem to move forward with ease, if you struggle against the fear that your time has passed and happiness has eluded you permanently, then remember that Charlotte too believed herself hopeless at 28, believed the whispers, and accepted society's dismissal of her worth. And yet patience brought her not to resignation but to joy, not to compromise, but to a love built on foundations of mutual respect and authentic recognition that sustained her through all the years that followed. And may you too find the courage to wait for connection that honors your true worth. May you develop the wisdom to distinguish between convenient compromise and genuine partnership. May you trust that your story unfolds according to its own necessary timing. And may you find peace in knowing that love, which arrives when you are ready to receive it, brings with it a depth and beauty that makes all the waiting worthwhile. And until that moment arrives, may you rest well knowing that your worth is not determined by society's narrow measures, but rather by the fullness of spirit you carry within you. And may you find comfort in the quiet certainty that patience, though difficult, ultimately leads not to loss, but to the truest form of happiness. This story was brought to you by Enchanting Escapes, where timeless tales of love and transformation await. And if Charlotte's journey has touched your heart, please share this story with someone who needs to hear that their worth is not diminished by waiting, that genuine love arrives in its own perfect time, and that patience ultimately brings us not to resignation, but to joy beyond measure.